Imagine a marriage where two people have not said the real thing to each other in 3 years. On the surface, everything looks fine. They go to dinners together, they laugh at the same shows, they tell people at parties that things are good. But underneath all of that, there is a conversation that never happened. Maybe it was about feeling unappreciated. Maybe it was about money, or intimacy, or a decision one of them made that the other never forgave but never mentioned. And every day that conversation doesn't happen, a little more distance grows. Not dramatically. Quietly. The way rust spreads. And by the time they finally sit in a therapist's office or a divorce lawyer's office, they don't say we had one big fight that broke everything. They say we just grew apart. But that's not what happened. What happened was 1,000 small silences that accumulated into a wall neither of them knew how to climb anymore. That is what avoiding hard conversations actually costs. Not the dramatic blow-up. The quiet erosion of everything that mattered. Most people think they avoid hard conversations because they are afraid of conflict. And that's partially true. But the deeper reason is more interesting and more honest than that. We avoid hard conversations because we are trying to protect something. Sometimes we are protecting the other person's feelings, which sounds noble until you realize that protecting someone from the truth is often just protecting yourself from the discomfort of delivering it. Sometimes we are protecting the relationship from short-term turbulence, not understanding that unspoken truths create far more long-term damage than any difficult conversation ever could. And sometimes, if we are being completely honest with ourselves, we are protecting our own vulnerability. Because once you say the real thing out loud, you cannot unsay it. It is now in the room. The other person gets to respond. And maybe that response will hurt, or disappoint, or change things permanently. Silence feels safer than that risk. The problem is that the short term always becomes the long term eventually. And what felt like protection slowly reveals itself as a slow-acting poison. There is a concept in psychology called conflict avoidance, and researchers who study relationships have found something that surprises almost everyone when they first hear it. The couples and friendships and working relationships that last and genuinely thrive are not the ones with the least conflict. They are the ones with the most productive conflict. John Gottman, a psychologist who has spent over 4 decades specifically studying what makes marriages succeed or fail, can predict with over 90% accuracy whether a couple will divorce, based almost entirely on how they handle disagreement. And the couples headed for divorce are not necessarily the ones who fight loudly or frequently. Some of the most troubled relationships he studied were characterized by what he called stonewalling, which is the complete shutdown of honest communication, where one or both people simply stop engaging with the difficult stuff entirely. The relationships that survived, that deepened over decades, were the ones where people had developed the courage and the skill to say the hard thing without weaponizing it. The conversation was never the danger. It was always the absence of it. Think about what this looks like in a workplace, because most people have lived this version of the story even if they haven't named it. Someone on a team is consistently difficult. Maybe they take credit for others' work, or they dismiss ideas in meetings, or they create an atmosphere where people feel small. And nobody says anything directly. Instead, people manage around them. Small accommodations are made. Complaints get whispered in hallways and over lunch, a whole culture of venting to each other rather than addressing the actual source. Then resentment builds slowly and steadily. Good people start leaving quietly, choosing to exit rather than have the conversation that might actually fix things. Productivity drops. The energy in the room changes in ways that are hard to articulate but impossible to miss. And the person at the center of all of it, the one whose behavior is causing the damage, often genuinely has no idea. Because nobody told them. Nobody had the conversation. The cost of that one avoided exchange is not just one person's discomfort. It ripples outward and touches everyone. This is as true in families as it is in offices, as true in friendships as it is in boardrooms. Avoided conversations don't disappear. They go underground, and underground is where they do their worst work. Patrick Lencioni, a business consultant who has spent his career studying what makes teams succeed or collapse, found that the single biggest destroyer of organizational performance is not incompetence or poor strategy or lack of resources. It is the absence of trust that develops when people are unwilling to be genuinely honest with each other. And that unwillingness almost always expresses itself as avoiding the conversations that need to happen. The feedback that never gets delivered. The disagreement that gets swallowed in a meeting and then festers outside of it. The fundamental strategic problem that everyone in the room can see and nobody will name because naming it feels too risky, too exposing, too likely to create friction. Organizations spend extraordinary amounts of money on consultants and restructuring and leadership programs while the actual problem is sitting right there in the silence between people who won't say the real thing to each other. Beyond relationships and workplaces, there is a physical cost to avoidance that most people don't fully appreciate until they feel it in their own body. Carrying an unspoken truth is not a neutral act. Holding something in that needs to come out, suppressing the conversation your nervous system knows needs to happen, takes a genuine physiological toll. Research on emotional suppression consistently shows that people who habitually swallow difficult feelings and avoid honest expression show elevated cortisol levels, higher blood pressure, weakened immune response, and significantly higher rates of anxiety and depression over time. James Pennebaker, a psychologist at the University of Texas, spent years studying what happens when people finally express things they have been holding back, whether through writing, through therapy, or through direct honest conversation. He found remarkable and measurable improvements in physical health alongside the psychological relief. The body, as trauma researcher Bessel van der Kolk wrote in one of the most important sentences in modern psychology, keeps score. What you don't say doesn't go away. It goes somewhere else. Into your sleep, your shoulders, your stomach, your immune system. The conversation you keep postponing is costing you more than you think, and the cost is not only emotional. There is also something worth understanding about the stories we tell ourselves about why a particular conversation is impossible. He won't listen anyway. She'll just get defensive. It will make everything worse. It's not worth the fight. These feel like rational assessments of the situation. They are almost never that. They are almost always sophisticated forms of self-protection dressed up as pragmatism. And the cruel irony is that the longer the conversation gets avoided, the more true those stories start to feel, because the distance and resentment that accumulate in silence do make the eventual conversation harder. The avoidance creates the very conditions that seem to justify more avoidance. It is a self-sealing loop, and the only way to break it is to go first before you feel ready, because feeling ready is a condition that avoidance will never allow to arrive. The most honest thing about hard conversations is that we construct them in our minds into something far more catastrophic than they actually turn out to be. There is a well-documented psychological phenomenon called affective forecasting, which is simply our ability to predict how we will feel about future events, and research consistently shows we are genuinely terrible at it in both directions. We dramatically overestimate how bad difficult experiences will feel and how long the bad feeling will last. The conversation you have been dreading and rehearsing for months, the one that feels like it could detonate everything, almost never goes as badly as the version you have been running in your head. Sometimes it goes surprisingly, disarmingly well. Sometimes it is genuinely hard and the other person does get defensive or emotional or says something that stings. But then the moment passes. Both people are still there. And what exists on the other side is almost always cleaner and lighter and more honest than what was there before. The anticipation of the hard conversation is reliably, consistently worse than the conversation itself. That gap between the imagined version and the real version is where most of the unnecessary suffering about difficult conversations actually lives. Something else worth sitting with. When you finally have the conversation you have been avoiding, you often discover that the other person had things they needed to say too. That the silence was not one-sided. That both of you had been waiting, each assuming the other didn't want to go there, when actually both of you were exhausted by the distance and desperately wanted the air to clear. This happens with stunning frequency in relationships of every kind. The conversation that felt like it would create a rupture turns out to be the thing that finally creates real closeness, because real closeness cannot exist without honesty, and honesty requires someone to go first. None of this is an argument for saying every difficult thing the moment it occurs to you with no consideration for timing or delivery. Hard conversations handled carelessly can cause genuine damage. Honesty without compassion is not virtue. It is just aggression with a justification attached. The goal is not to unload every uncomfortable truth for the sake of your own relief. The goal is to say the necessary thing in a way that keeps the relationship intact and opens the door to something better on the other side. That requires courage, yes, but it equally requires care. The care is what makes it a conversation rather than an attack. And most people, when they approach hard conversations with both honesty and genuine regard for the other person, find that the conversation lands very differently than they feared. Because people can feel the difference between someone who is trying to hurt them and someone who cares enough to be honest with them even when it costs something. Every relationship in your life, every one that has real depth and real staying power, was built on someone being willing at some point to say the uncomfortable thing. To risk the awkwardness. To choose the short-term discomfort of honesty over the long-term damage of silence. That willingness is not a personality trait some people are born with and others aren't. It is a choice. A repeatable, learnable, practicable choice. And the more you make it, the more you discover that the world does not end when you say the real thing. The world actually gets a little more real. A little more livable. A little more like the place you always wanted it to be, full of relationships where you don't have to manage what you say and carefully curate what you show, but can simply be honest and trust that honesty, offered with care, is almost always the most loving thing you can give another person. Going first is the cost of entry into relationships that are actually real. And real, in the end, is the only kind worth having.